The 15th of December, 1863. Dawn breaks cold over Phillips County, Arkansas. The cotton fields lie beneath a thin veil of frost, the air sharp enough to cut skin. Inside a wooden house, Monroe Boen, the master of this land, believes the day will begin as any other. But outside, West Bogan, an African-American man bound in chains of servitude, grips the handle of an axe. Years of humiliation, blood, and sweat have forged his resolve. When the sun lifts, so does his hand, and the silence shatters forever. Phillips County, Arkansas, December 1863. The Civil War raged across the nation, but here in the Mississippi Delta, the war felt far away. Cotton still ruled. Even as Union armies pushed deeper into the South, plantation owners clung to their power, clung to the people they forced into labor, as though nothing could shake the old order. The crack of whips still carried across the fields. The songs of the enslaved, low and sorrowful, still drifted through the night. For the men and women bent under its weight, war meant little chains were chains, whether the flag above was Union blue or Confederate gray. Life on Monroe Boen's plantation was a theater of cruelty. The land was fertile, rich with rows of white cotton that stretched like snow under the southern sky. But to those who worked it, the beauty of the land was poisoned. The cabins where African-American families lived were little more than wooden boxes. In winter, the wind slipped through the cracks and gnawed at their bones. In summer, the air pressed down like an oven, baking the dirt floors beneath their feet. Food was scarce, sleep was broken, and every day began with the same command: work. West Boen was one of those men. To the records of the time, he was nothing but property, a line on Monroe Boen's ledger. To his neighbors, he was invisible. But to himself, West was a man carrying decades of silent scars. His body bore the proof of forced labor: calloused hands, scarred back, shoulders hardened by years in the fields. He was treated not as human, but as an object of profit. Cotton picked, cotton weighed, cotton sold. His name meant little to those who claimed to own him, but inside West burned the knowledge that he was more than the sum of their cruelty. The plantation's rhythm was relentless. Dawn meant the fields, noon meant exhaustion, night meant collapsing into sleep that never lasted long. The only breaks were punctuated by violence: an overseer's strike, Monroe's mocking voice. Every sound of boot heels on the porch meant dread. Every breath of relief was fragile, uncertain. West learned early that silence was survival, but silence did not erase anger. It only buried it deeper, pressed it into the core of his being like coal waiting to become fire. By the winter of 1863, as armies marched and governments debated the fate of millions, West Boen's world remained chained. But change was moving through the land, whispered in secret, carried on scraps of news. In the cold mornings before the fields filled with labor, the men and women of Phillips County dreamed of something beyond the horizon. Freedom was coming, but not fast enough for West. Monroe Boen was not unique. He was the embodiment of a system, a man shaped by the South's belief in absolute ownership. But on his plantation, he was more than just a planter. He was a tyrant. His shadow stretched long over every cabin, every furrow of earth. His presence was a constant weight, his voice a reminder of power. When he walked across the wooden porch, the boards groaned, and every person in earshot stiffened. To them, that sound meant danger. He carried himself like a king, the clothes on his back, the polished boots, the silver buckle on his belt. These were symbols of control. His whip, always within reach, was not just a tool of punishment. It was a crown, a scepter, a declaration that lives where his to shape, to wound, to destroy. Monroe rarely needed to raise his hand. His reputation did the striking for him. His laughter, sharp and cruel, carried as much pain as his lash. West Boen knew that sound too well. For years, he had felt the humiliation of being treated as less than human. Monroe called him by names meant to strip away dignity, words that cut deeper than rope or chain. When visitors came to the plantation, Monroe displayed West as if he were showing off livestock, pointing, mocking, reducing a man to nothing more than proof of wealth. It was not enough to own him. Monroe needed to break him, to remind him daily that resistance was useless. And yet, in West's eyes, Monroe was more than an overseer or master. He was the living face of every wound carved into his back, every insult spat into his ears. He was the system given flesh. Each time Monroe's boots echoed on the porch, West heard not just one man, but the crushing weight of slavery itself. What Monroe never saw was the fire smoldering beneath West's silence. He mistook endurance for weakness, obedience for surrender. He believed his rule eternal, his authority unquestionable. He believed the war beyond his fields could never touch him. But history has a way of finding its mark. Even men who think themselves untouchable can bleed. Even masters can fall. Monroe Boen lived as if the world bent to his will. For years it did, but on that winter morning, when frost still covered the cotton rows, he stepped into the path of a man who had reached his breaking point. The years left marks that no eye could ignore. West Bogan's back carried scars like crooked rivers, reminders of lashes meant to silence. His hands, hardened into leather, were the tools of a man who had spent too many seasons pulling white cotton from thorny stems. Every scar, every callus, every ache was testimony. He did not speak of it. He did not need to. His body told the story. Nights were the hardest. The cabins, rough-hewn boxes of timber, rattled with every wind gust. Families huddled under thin blankets, stomachs growling, breath fogging in the cold air. Some prayed softly, their voices trembling like candles in the dark. Others sat in silence, staring at the walls as if freedom might appear there. West lay awake, staring at the ceiling beams, the bitter taste of humiliation burning his throat. He remembered the laughter of Monroe Boen, sharp as the crack of a whip. He remembered being called by names that stripped him of manhood. To Monroe, he was not West. He was property, a thing. Humiliation did not end when the sun set. Even in daylight, Monroe found ways to remind West of his place. He would call him forward in front of others, not to praise, but to mock. He compared him to beasts of burden, reducing him to animal status before men, women, and children. The sting of those words carried longer than any lash. In moments like these, West felt himself fracture like a cup dropped onto stone, not shattered entirely, but cracked, fissures spreading, waiting for the moment when the structure could no longer hold. Still, he endured, day after day, season after season. His silence was armor, his patience a weapon. Each insult pressed deeper into his memory, stored away, waiting. The overseers mistook that silence for submission. Monroe mistook it for fear. But endurance has a limit, and humiliation is not a chain that lasts forever. For West, the years of degradation became kindling, each scar another splinter of wood, each insult another spark. What he carried inside him was not brokenness, it was pressure, building, coiling, preparing. His soul, battered but unyielding, waited for a chance. And that chance, though he did not yet know it, was closer than anyone realized. In January of 1863, the world outside Phillips County shifted. President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. Word spread slowly, carried like contraband, whispered in cabins, passed in secret conversations by firelight. For the enslaved, the words were fragile promises. Freedom, written on paper, but guarded by armies still far away. On Monroe Bogan's plantation, news seeped in like smoke under a door. West heard it late one night, a hushed voice carried from neighbor to neighbor. Lincoln says we are free. The words struck like thunder in the silence. Some laughed nervously, afraid to believe. Others wept, daring to hope. For a moment, the cabins felt lighter, as if the air itself had changed. But daylight brought the truth. In Arkansas, in the stronghold of the Confederacy, Monroe still reigned. His whip still cracked, his voice still mocked. His power was not erased by the stroke of a pen hundreds of miles away. Here, the law of the land was the law of the master. Freedom might exist in proclamation, but chains remained in reality. For West, the whispers became both a comfort and a torment. He clung to them in the long nights, replaying them like a prayer. We are free, but every dawn, the sight of Monroe's boots on the porch told him otherwise. The contradiction gnawed at him, tearing at the fragile walls of patience he had built. If freedom was his by right, then every insult, every blow, every humiliation was no longer just cruelty, it was theft. Among the cabins, hope flickered, but it flickered dangerously. Men and women who once endured silently now dreamed aloud. They imagined walking away, imagined fields without chains, imagined a dawn where the sound of work songs gave way to hymns of liberty. But with every whisper came risk. To be heard speaking of freedom was to invite punishment. Still, they whispered. Still, they dreamed. And West, listening to those voices, felt the fire in him swell. Humiliation had fractured him. Whispers of freedom filled the cracks. What had once been silent, endurance began to shift into something else. Something sharper, something ready. By the winter of 1863, West no longer asked if freedom would come. He asked only when and what he would do when the chance arrived. The night before the 15th of December was bitter. Cold winds crept through the cracks of the cabins, carrying with them a silence heavy as stone. West Bogan sat by the dying embers of the hearth, his hands resting on his knees, his mind far from sleep. Every sound of the night seemed louder, the groan of wood, the rustle of straw, the faint cough of a child in a nearby cabin. But one sound stayed etched in his skull: Monroe Bogan's laughter. Earlier that day, Monroe had humiliated him once again. The insult had been sharp, delivered with the casual cruelty of a man who believed his authority eternal. A slap across the face, followed by a mocking grin. For most, it was just another blow in a lifetime of degradations. For West, it was the drop of water that tipped the cup. Years of humiliation, years of scars, years of whispered promises of freedom, everything converged into that single moment. He felt the fracture inside him give way. West rose and stepped outside into the biting air. The moon hung pale above the cotton fields, and frost glittered on the ground like shards of glass. His eyes fell on the chopping block near the cabin door. The axe, still embedded in the wood from the day's labor, gleamed faintly in the moonlight. Its handle was worn smooth by years of use. It had always been a tool. That night, it became something else. He wrapped his hand around the haft. The weight was familiar, comforting, but it carried a new meaning. The axe was no longer just for splitting wood. It was a choice, a voice, a weapon carved from silence itself. He felt its balance, lifted it, set it down again. Each motion was steady, deliberate. He was no longer simply enduring, he was deciding. In the stillness of that night, West did not sleep. He sat with the axe beside him, staring into the embers until they burned out. He thought of the whispers of freedom. He thought of the children growing up in chains. He thought of every lash that had torn his back, every insult that had stripped his dignity. He thought of the frost-covered dawn waiting just beyond the horizon. When morning came, he would act. There would be no more silence, no more waiting. The breaking point had arrived. Dawn crept over Phillips County with a pale, icy light. The fields lay quiet under their blanket of frost, every stalk of cotton stiff with cold. The cabins stirred with muted life, shuffling feet, muted coughs, the resigned motions of another day of toil. But for West Bogan, this dawn was unlike any other. His grip tightened around the axe, the wood pressed firm against his palm, his heart beat in his chest like a drum calling him forward. Monroe Boen stepped out of his house as he always did, expecting another day of dominion. He was wrapped in a coat, his boots striking the porch with that same familiar rhythm that once filled others with dread. But West no longer heard fear in those footsteps. He heard the hollow sound of arrogance, the rhythm of a world about to collapse. The air was sharp, every breath turning into mist. For a moment, time seemed suspended, the field hushed, the sky holding its breath. West lifted the axe. His arms, built from years of forced labor, carried it as if it weighed nothing. The silence was broken not by screams, but by the sound of wood splitting, the sound of history tearing. Monroe staggered, shock flashing across his face. For the first time, the master was not untouchable. For the first time, power shifted. It was not a drawn-out struggle, not a spectacle of violence. It was swift, decisive, final. The strike that fell was not just against Monroe, it was against every humiliation, every lash, every stolen year. When it was over, the frost still glistened, the cotton rows still stretched toward the horizon. The sun continued to rise, but something irreversible had occurred. West stood breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling, his pulse pounding in his ears. Around him, the world remained eerily quiet. No cheers, no cries, just the sound of his own heart refusing to slow. In that moment, he was not a slave. He was a man who had acted, a man who had taken fate into his own scarred hands. The dawn of the 15th of December had begun like countless others, but as the sun rose higher, it illuminated a truth that could never be undone. West Bogan had broken the silence. Word traveled fast across Phillips County. By mid-morning, whispers had already reached neighboring plantations. Monroe Boen was dead, struck down by one of his own. Fear spread quicker than smoke. Masters looked over their shoulders, overseers tightened their grips on their whips, and armed men mounted horses, spurred not by justice but by panic. To them, West Bogan was not a man who had reached a breaking point. He was a warning, a spark that could set their entire world ablaze. West did not run. After the deed was done, he stood in the frost-stiffened yard, his chest heaving, the axe still heavy in his hands. He knew escape was possible. The Mississippi lay not too far away, and beyond it stretched paths that could lead to Union lines. Others might have tried to vanish into the woods, to lose themselves in swamps, or hide among the enslaved on neighboring farms. But West did not move. Perhaps he knew the county would hunt him down, no matter how far he fled. Perhaps he felt the weight of inevitability, or perhaps, for the first time in his life, he simply refused to be chased. By midday, armed riders surrounded the plantation. Local militia, neighbors carrying muskets, men whose fear of rebellion outweighed their mercy. They found West standing still, his eyes steady, his hands lowered but not trembling. When they bound his wrists, he did not resist. The act was already complete. The strike had been made, the silence shattered. Whatever came next, he had already spoken louder than any chain could silence. Some witnesses claimed he uttered no words as he was led away, his face set like stone. Others whispered that he said something under his breath, something about freedom, about dignity, but the truth was blurred by time. What mattered was the image, a man once reduced to property, now walking upright, shackled, but not bowed. As the militia marched him toward the county jail, the world around him seemed unchanged. The cotton still waved in the wind, the cabins still smoked from cooking fires, the fields still stretched wide. But those who saw him knew a shift had occurred. A man had dared to raise his hand against the master. The myth of invincibility had cracked, and no matter how swiftly they tried to erase it, that image lingered. The trial came quickly, as if the county wished to bury the matter before it spread. In the courthouse, the wooden benches filled with white planters, overseers, and townsfolk who came not for justice but for reassurance that the old order would hold, that rebellion could be crushed with a sentence. West Bogan was brought forward in irons. The court gave him no advocate, no chance to speak. His guilt was assumed the moment Monroe's body hit the ground. The judge, a man steeped in the same system that had owned West, treated the proceeding less as trial than as formality. Witnesses testified not of Monroe's cruelty, not of years of humiliation, but of the danger posed by allowing West's act to stand unpunished. To them, this was not about one death. It was about fear of contagion, fear that other men and women in chains might follow his example. The verdict was swift, death by hanging. The words fell like iron bars, sealing the fate of a man who had never been allowed his own voice. Yet even in this, the case did not rest easily. The nation was at war, and the Emancipation Proclamation had already shifted the legal ground beneath them. Union troops were advancing, and laws regarding the enslaved were under scrutiny. Some argued quietly, reluctantly, that executing West might conflict with new federal mandates. Still, in Phillips County, hesitation was brief. The court's declaration was more ritual than law, a way to restore shaken order. Men left the courthouse muttering that the example would be made, that fear would be put back into the cabins. But others, even among the white community, felt a chill. They had seen the resolve in West's eyes. They had heard the rumors of whispers of freedom. They knew the world was changing, and no rope could halt it. West himself remained silent. In a world where his voice had been denied for a lifetime, silence became its own statement. He had acted. He had refused to bow. And now, as he waited in the shadow of the gallows, he carried that silence like a crown. The days after the trial stretched like an endless winter. West Bogan sat in his cell, the walls damp, the straw thin beneath him. Shackles clinked softly whenever he shifted, but he no longer strained against them. The decision had been made. The axe had fallen. Now, all that remained was the slow approach of the gallows. Outside those walls, the nation itself was trembling. In the north, African American soldiers were marching into battle under the Union flag. They carried rifles, wore uniforms, and sang songs of freedom. In the South, planters clung desperately to their crumbling world, terrified of the tide that was rising against them. Between these two realities sat West, a man condemned by one system, but whose act echoed with the spirit of the other. The people of Phillips County came to see him, not to offer comfort, but to satisfy curiosity. To some, he was a monster. proof that granting humanity to the enslaved meant chaos. To others, whispered quietly in cabins and fields, he was something more. They dared not say it aloud, but in their hearts, they carried his image as a flicker of hope. A man had stood against the master and had not flinched. West's silence became its own kind of defiance. He did not beg, he did not curse, he did not plead for mercy. His quiet presence unnerved his captors more than rage ever could. For them, a man broken was easier to understand. But a man who walked calmly toward death was dangerous, because he carried with him a story that could not be silenced. The gallows loomed on the horizon, both literal and symbolic. In a nation tearing itself apart, West's execution was meant to be a reminder. This is what happens when you defy the order. But history was already unraveling that order. Even as the rope was measured and the scaffold prepared, Union victories in distant fields were reshaping the very meaning of freedom. In the shadow of the gallows, West Bogan waited. He knew he would not live to see liberty declared across the South. But he also knew this: the dawn he created would outlast the morning of the 15th of December. The silence he had broken could never be fully restored. When the end came, it was swift, as most executions were, but the weight of West Bogan's act did not die with him. In the official records, his name was listed briefly, a mark in the ledger of Phillips County. In the hearts of those who lived in chains, it lingered far longer. He had not killed to gain riches, nor to seize power. He had killed because the silence of humiliation had reached its end. Because a man can only be denied his humanity for so long before the fire inside consumes the fear. His act was not just an ending. It was a beginning, a declaration written not on paper, but in blood and frost, in the swing of an axe at dawn. History would not remember him as neatly as generals or presidents. His name would not be carved into marble. Instead, it would survive in fragments, whispers in family stories, echoes in communities who saw in him a figure of resistance. Even as the county tried to bury him beneath the noose, they could not bury the truth that he had stood up, if only once, if only briefly, against a world that had tried to erase him. Was he a criminal? To the law of his time, yes, but to the enslaved who heard his story, he was something else entirely. A man who dared. A man who chose defiance over submission, even knowing the cost. In that choice, he transformed a single morning into a timeless question. Because on that frost-covered dawn, West Bogan was more than a condemned man. He was a symbol of the human will to resist, even when resistance seems impossible. His act did not topple plantations, did not end slavery in Arkansas, but it cracked the silence. And once silence is broken, it can never be mended the same way again. Today, his name may be nearly forgotten, buried in the margins of history. But if we listen closely, we can still hear that morning. The frost crunching underfoot, the axe rising in scarred hands, the silence splitting open. West Bogan did not live to see freedom. Yet, in his defiance, he called it by name.